many ways from the mother of Heather Heyer, the woman killed in Charlottesville. Moments ago, Susan Bro levied a direct and blistering message to the president. Listen to this.
We understand that President Trump has reached out. Have you talked to him directly yet?
I have not, and now I will not. At first, I just missed his calls. The first call, it looked like actually came during the funeral. I didn't even see that message. There were 3 more frantic messages from press secretaries throughout the day, and I didn't know why. That would have been on Wednesday. And I was home recovering from the exhaustion of the funeral, and so I thought, well, I'll get to him later. And then I had more meetings to establish her foundation. So I hadn't really watched the news until last night. And I'm not talking to the president now. I'm sorry. After what he said about my child. And it's not that I saw somebody else's tweets about him. I saw an actual clip of him at a press conference equating the protesters like Ms. Heyer with the KKK and the white supremacists.
And that is where you are right now, because after his statement, after he read his statement on Monday, you thanked him, but now you've had a chance to hear his remarks from Tuesday, and that has changed your position as far as the president is concerned and wanting to hear from him.
Absolutely. You can't wash this one away by shaking my hand and saying I'm sorry.
Is there something, though, that
I'm not forgiving for that.
Is there something, though, that you would want to say to the president?
Think before you speak.
All right. Wow. And you will remember the president was gushing with praise of Heather Heyer's mother just days ago. CNN's Athena Jones live in New Jersey, not far from the president's golf resort there. Athena, that was a very emotional, in some ways stunning response from the mother of Heather Heyer. Any word from the White House yet?
Hi, John. No, I reached out to a couple of White House officials in the last hour to try to get a response to Susan Bro's comments. I haven't received any response so far, but I think what's notable is what we heard, not just throughout that exchange there, but also at the end when she said to the president, think before you speak. And I think that's one of the central concerns of the president's critics. They believe that he is thinking before he's speaking and tweeting, that he's speaking and tweeting his real, true thoughts. The thoughts that he shared on Saturday that got so much criticism when he talked about on many sides, and then the thoughts that he shared, again, not teleprompter aided, on Tuesday when he had that stunning back and forth at Trump Tower. Let's remind you mentioned that the president had some glowing words to say about Susan Bro at that press conference. Let's play a little bit of that.
Her mother wrote me and said, through, I guess, Twitter, social media, the nicest things, and I very much appreciated that. I hear she was a fine, really actually an incredible young woman, but her mother on Twitter thanked me for what I said.
So there you heard the president celebrating this comment that he'd gotten from Susan Bro's mother. But remember, that was after the Monday remarks, the teleprompter-aided remarks in which he condemned the KKK, neo-Nazis, and white supremacists by name. That is when Susan Bro wrote saying that she thanked him for his words of comfort. But that was undone by his remarks on Tuesday, Don, and that is what she was just responding to there on GMA, on Good Morning America.
Can't wash away what he said, says Susan Bro with a handshake. Again, emotional words there. Some surprising words also overnight, Athena, from, at a minimum, a family which has been extremely supportive of the President of the United States, from James Murdoch, the CEO of 21st Century Fox, as in Fox News. Explain.
Absolutely. We're talking about Rupert Murdoch's son. Rupert Murdoch is one of the president's allies and friends, someone he speaks to frequently. And of course, Fox, one of the networks he likes to watch. This is what James Murdoch said. I'll just read you some excerpts. He said, "What we watched this last week in Charlottesville and the reaction to it by the President of the United States concerns all of us as Americans and free people. He went on to say, I can't even believe I have to write this. Standing up to Nazis is essential. There are no good Nazis. So a very strong reaction from one of the president's allies in the media, and that emotional reaction from Heather Heyer's mother. And this follows increasing number of Republicans who are calling out the president. We saw yesterday Tennessee Senator Bob Corker, who has not been a big critic of the president, questioning his stability and his competence. So this is a serious time here, John.
All right, Athena Jones, as we've been saying, the island getting smaller, the support network for the president dwindling by the day here. Right, Athena Jones in New Jersey, thanks so much. Joining me now, CNN politics reporter Eugene Scott, CNN political analyst Amy Parnes, and Patrick Healy. Eugene, first to you, because you've been doing some reporting on the comments this morning from Susan Bro. Again, very emotional. I mean, this comes from the mother of the woman who was killed, standing up for what she believed in, who flat out says she will not even speak to the president. And in her opinion, the president was equating her daughter with the white supremacists and neo-Nazis that were marching.
Indeed. I took away two things from her interview. One, she was offended by the insensitivity of the White House in trying to reach her during the funeral and during the moments after the funeral, which were a very personal and exhausting time for her, as she said. But something that's also very important is many Trump surrogates have said that the president was clear. He was very clear in condemning white supremacy in his words. What she heard, what Susan Bro heard, was the president equating these white supremacists with the activists, her daughter included. So I think it just exemplified just how much the White House and President Donald Trump in particular have not addressed this issue in ways where all Americans know where he clearly stands.
It's a very good point. That is what Susan Bro heard. It is what James Murdoch heard. It's what Bob Corker, Republican senator from Tennessee, we heard Athena Jones talking about that before. He's the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's not a bomb thrower by any stretch of the imagination. He was on the short list to be Secretary of State. Listen to what Bob Corker said.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful.
His comments on Tuesday started erasing the comments that were strong. What we want to see from our president is clarity and moral authority, and that moral authority is compromised when Tuesday happens. There's no question about that.
We also heard from Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina there, Amy Parnes. And just take a step back here. I don't want people to lose the big picture here, the scope, the breadth of the people coming out against what the president said now. Moments ago, it now includes the mother of Heather Heyer, but James Murdoch overnight, Senator Bob Corker. Charities. Right. You have charity groups like the Cleveland Clinic and the American Cancer Society pulling out of events at Mar-a-Lago. All these people want to do is raise money to cure cancer. Now they're not even willing to do it at a Trump establishment.
Right. The chips are starting to fall. You see the business community, you see lawmakers. I'm hearing from sources every day who say this is acceptable. The drumbeat is getting worse. You know, it started with North Korea last week. It was the cops comment a couple of weeks ago that really got some people really frustrated and wound up. They're kind of fed up at this point with their president. And I think when Congress comes back into session, you're going to start hearing a lot more of that. You're going to start seeing people say, okay, this is not acceptable. You need to start taking it very seriously. You need to start implementing some stability so Americans feel more secure.
It's very interesting. Bob Corker there used the word stability. The opposite of stability is instability there. So there are incredibly loaded words from the senator. Tim Scott used another phrase, Patrick Healy, moral authority, which in some ways might be the most powerful, weapon that the president yields. And if that moral authority is weakened, he or she is not left with very much.
It's so true, John. I mean, these are the moments, in America's history, and when we look to the president sometimes to really clarify what is going on, what is happening in the country. I'm sure Tim Scott, being from South Carolina, remembers very much President Obama's speech in Charleston after the shootings at the memorial there. These are moments when presidents sort of reveal themselves and prove themselves. They're not actors, John, but they're people who look into the country, what it's feeling, sort of the emotional, the psychological damage that these moments have, and is able to bring people together. And what President Trump did in this really, first big opportunity he zigged and zagged. He equated different groups. He sort of spread blame around in a way that I think people, frankly, on all sides were just so baffled by.
Eugene Scott, I want to go back to you on an issue here that is key, because what we saw from the president yesterday was an attempt to turn this issue from his comments saying that very fine people were there marching alongside the neo-Nazis and white supremacists to the debate, which has been going on for an awfully long time, about Confederate symbols and Confederate monuments. There are some people who will say that is a safer debate politically than a debate over whether there are good people who march with Nazis. However, you make the case that this is all one continuing slope in the issue of identity politics, which is an arena where the president likes to play.
It is true. I mean, there is this thought that identity politics is this topic that is exclusive to the left. And the reality is that's just not true. What the president displayed, his opinions on Confederate statues, are the same values that many of his white working class voters in rural spaces feel about Confederate statues and the Confederate legacy as a whole. I think the challenge that he and his team are going to have to ask themselves, and I think Bob Corker and Tim Scott were getting to this a bit, is will playing into the identity politics of these white working class voters who have these reverent views of Confederate statues hurt him with black and brown voters, a demographic that the Republican Party has struggled with for years, and in recent years before Trump has really tried to win.
It was low already. I mean, you can't lose much support from where he was on that. All right, Amy. Another event that happened overnight, we were talking about the Barcelona attacks. One of the president's first responses to these attacks was to put out this statement. I call it an official statement. He put it out on Twitter, where he suggested people look at what he called the record of General Pershing. I'm going to play you some sound of what the president said about the same thing a little more than a year ago. Listen to this.
And he dipped 50 bullets in pig's blood. And he had his men load his rifles. And he lined up the 50 people. And they shot 49 of those people. And the 50th person, he said, you go back to your people and you tell them what happened. And for 25 years, there wasn't a problem.
Amy, three things here. Number one, historians will tell you that never happened. So the president, as president, over the last 24 hours, spreading what appears to be a lie. Number two, as president, even if it did happen, he'd be endorsing war crimes. You know, and number three, there's no proof that General Pershing's actions were even effective, whatever they were, in fighting Muslim extremism in the Philippines during that time. All that aside, what this shows is the president acting in a way. Again, we talk about moral authority right here. People look to presidents, especially in times of terror attacks, for how they respond. What does this tell them about how he responds?
Well, it kind of reflects this instability, as we talked about. You know, people were looking at him. His first tweet yesterday was, you stay strong, we're sending love. That's sort of the sentiment that people needed right now, you know, as a country to kind of feel that. But then he went back and said, oh no, you know, look at this, follow this Pershing thing, which was completely, it's a fable. And so I think this kind of adds to that and fuels the fire of this instability that people are feeling, and why lawmakers are coming out, and you'll see, as I said before, more and more of them. If he continues to make these remarks, Heather Heyer'S mom came out today, it's not appropriate for this moment. It's maybe not even appropriate on the campaign trail, but particularly in the office of the president.
All right, Patrick, Amy, Eugene, thanks so much for being with us again. We do have breaking news this morning. The manhunt for the driver of a van who plowed through a crowd in Barcelona. 4 arrested in these 2 attacks so far in Spain. We're on top of all the new developments. Plus, another controversial statue removed overnight after the president said ripping down these, quote, beautiful Confederate statues would destroy U.S. culture. And holy split, a rift deepens.
The Republican Party pushing back against the president. Senators like Bob Corker, Tim Scott questioning not only what he said, but now his stability, his ability to leave, his moral authority, in their words. What is the impact of this as the president is increasingly isolated? Let's bring in CNN political analyst Ron Brownstein and CNN politics reporter and editor-at-large Chris Cillizza. Gentlemen, nice to have you here. Let's take a moment to listen. Good morning. Let's take a moment to listen to Senator Corker, because this is someone who has, you know, taken pains to not call out the president a lot. He was considered possibly for VP, Secretary of State, but he didn't hold back yesterday.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful. He also recently has not demonstrated that he understands the character of this nation.
Chris Eliza, this was the point in your newsletter last night. That's a big deal, those words.
Yeah, I think they are. I think, Pop, you rightly note the source matters, right? This is not Lindsey Graham or John McCain, both serious senators, but people who have never been even close to Trump fans. This is Bob Corker, someone who has worked hard to keep a line of communication open with this White House. And so when you hear anything critical of Trump from him, I think you pay attention. I think the critique is even more important. This is not about, well, the president says some things that maybe he shouldn't say, right? That was sort of what Lee Zeldin was saying earlier in the show. This is a fundamental questioning of whether the president of the United States is up for the job that he currently holds. Corker uses the word stability twice in that Q&A with reporters. He uses the word competence twice. When a sitting Republican senator who is not a Trump hater questions the stability and competence of the president of the United States, it's, number one, not an accident, and number two, is something we need to pay attention.
But numbers matter. And there are a lot more Zeldins, Ron, than there are Corkers. Lee Zeldin, I said he was burning a lot of calories, not to disrespect the congressman, but just, you know, to give you a profile in the truth there. You know, the idea that, well, yes, dipping bullets in pig's blood and slaughtering Muslims and trying to disrespect their faith while we do it is not an effective mode of anti-terror that we're studying right now. That's about as generous assessment of a BS story and suggestion that you can offer. And there are a lot more people doing that kind of speaking out about the president than what Corker just did. What does that mean?
Well, sure. I mean, look, first of all, I mean, the argument from most Republicans that, you know, you hear privately is we can't criticize the president more forcefully while our base is still with him, while our own voters are still with him. As I said in the last hour, if you look historically, that has not been a disqualifying dynamic for earlier generations of leaders. I mean, basically every time when people in Congress have stood up to a president from their own party, from William Fulbright on Vietnam in '66 to the Senate Republicans on Watergate in the '70s, that president was still overwhelmingly popular with voters in their own party. Leadership matters. Leadership can shape public opinion. And I think also, I think it's really important for Republicans, I think, in Congress to understand what the trajectory of this administration is. I mean, Steve Bannon, you know, kind of came out of seclusion with emails and comments to several news organizations in the last few days saying, if they want to talk about race every day, we'll win talking about economics. In fact, I would argue to you the sequence is exactly the opposite. It was only after the health care bill and the erosion that created in the president's support among blue-collar and older adults, two cornerstones of his coalition, when he kind of moved away from his promise to protect them economically during the campaign. Only after that have we seen the administration turn sharply right on a series of cultural and racial issues, culminating in Charlottesville. And I think that is what Republicans can probably expect more of in the months and years ahead. And they've got to decide, are they willing to stay on that ride?
And just, Poppy, just quickly to add to the trajectory point, where, if you're a Republican elected official, let's say, where do you think this goes? I mean, you know, I heard someone last night say, well, what's needed, I think it was Jack Kingston, what's needed is that Donald Trump may need, you know, he needs a course correction. This is Donald Trump. He's a 71-year-old man. We now have 2+ years of him as either as a candidate and now as president. The idea that Donald Trump is suddenly going to become someone other than who he is seems to me a little bit of a fantasy.
And it's not only the personal kind of qualities. There is clearly a political calculation here. Right? From the beginning, President Trump and his team have believed that the way to win is to mobilize the elements of the Republican coalition, first in the primary and then in the country, that are the most uneasy about demographic change, whether it's, you know, blue collar, older, evangelical, and non-urban whites. And mobilizing that base and feeding that base has been the most consistent political note. And so the question for Republicans is, do they believe that is enough in a diversifying, urbanizing country? It is not only moral, there's a political calculus at work for them as well.
All right, gentlemen. Appreciate it. Thank you for the perspective. as always. You have to say, if nothing else, what we've seen with Charlottesville and what the president said about studying the fake Pershing story, it's very clear what his strategy is and who he's trying to cultivate. Will it work for the country? See. U.S. college basketball teams caught in Spain during that deadly terror attack. How did they fare? What did they do? The details in the Bleacher Report.
Rap really starts to take hold.
Duke and Dr. Dre at the door.
Missy Elliott.
Biggie Small.
President Trump is trying to move away from drawing a moral equivalence between both sides of the violence in Charlottesville and to the issue of Confederate statues and monuments. The president tweeting, "Sad to see the history and culture of our great country being ripped apart with the removal of our beautiful statues and monuments." Remember, the president during the campaign said the Confederate flag should come down and be put away in a museum. So he's changed. Play some politics. Let's discuss the merits. We have Michael Eric Dyson, author of Tears We Cannot Stop, A Sermon to White America, and Al Brophy, law professor at the University of Alabama. Professor Brophy, let's start with you. Keep the statues up because...
I think they're reminders of the bad old days. It's important to remember that once in this country, the people who were in power were supporters of the Confederacy and wanted to keep alive the memory of the war fought to maintain slavery. And I think it's important to remember that history, and those statues are great ways of remembering that history and continuing to have a dialogue about that history.
Michael, counterpoint.
Well, the point is, I understand that. In a neutral atmosphere, that makes sense. In a non-politically charged atmosphere, that would be great. But when those symbols are used to reinforce white supremacy, which has material consequence, empirical consequence, people are dying, people are clashing, people are being hurt, it's endorsing, it's not teaching. Teaching is about the neutral observation of factors that can be considered when we're making an argument about American history. Endorsing suggests that this is a powerful ideal to which we aspire, and as a result of that, those symbols can be used to hurt and harm the very people who would neutrally observe it. So while I understand what the professor is arguing here, in this highly charged moment, this is about America's values and what we're reinforcing to our children and the people who are our citizens.
Professor, is it not relevant when they were put up, the turn of the century, during Jim Crow, almost as an in-your-face reminder that the spirit of the Confederacy, which is a malignancy to the unity of this country, still lived at that time?
I think it's incredibly important when they were put up, and that's, I think, precisely the point. I agree with Professor Dyson's argument that we shouldn't just have the monuments by themselves. We need to do the hard work of interpreting them, and I think the virtue of having monuments there is that people can then ask, well, why is it that somebody put a statue of General Lee up in Charlottesville in 1924? And that allows us, having the monuments up there allows us to have ongoing discussions. Obviously, they need to be contextualized.
But how do you contextualize something that on its face is a celebration?
Sure. By counter monuments is one example. In Talbot, Maryland, there's a statue of Frederick Douglass, who was from the great abolitionist, who's from Talbot, alongside a monument put up in the early 20th century to Confederate soldiers. I think that's exactly the kind of dialogue we want. Look, these statues are almost surely going to come down. There's nothing so powerless as an idea whose time is past. They're going to come down, but I think there's a danger in taking them.
Michael.
Well, I think the danger in leaving them up is even greater. Again, in a neutral atmosphere where we are objective or as fair as possible, the professor's point is salient and cogent. But in the midst of a culture where we continually battle over what those meanings are, Martin Luther King Jr. couldn't even get a birthday until recently, when the President of the United States of America, Ronald Reagan, in begrudgingly signing that legislation, said, well, we'll see in 20-some-odd years whether he's a communist or not. If we couldn't even agree that Martin Luther King Jr. was worthy of celebration, of the ideals of this country. We know that when we look at Robert E. Lee or Stonewall Jackson, what we're arguing here is this is a manifestation of our ideals. These are the noble aspirations we have. So there are a lot of kids who are not going to ask, hey, why do we have a Robert E. Lee statue? They're going to say, you're darn right we got that Robert E. Lee statue because that represents what we believe. And slavery was a value that we still hold fast to. Why don't we have statues of Huey P. Newton? Because why? In this, who was a Black Panther? Because this represents American sacred ground. The national memory is being not only tested, it's being reinforced. Again, I agree with the professor when we don't have lives at stake. When lives are at stake, we have to talk about what those values mean, what those memorials mean, and what we are celebrating in public space with public funds to reinforce the value of our civilization.
Professor, does it concern you who is taking the side of preservation right now, that you had white supremacists down there, that you have the president who seems intent on playing identity politics right now? Remember, this is a man who, when he was campaigning, said the Confederate flag should come down. Its time had passed. It should be put in the museum. Now, all of a sudden, he sees these monuments as a beautiful piece of history that you should not disturb. Do the motivations suggest that this is not as pure a principle as you're putting it out as?
I think it's very important who's advocating for keeping them. I see a difference between flags and monuments. I think Confederate flags obviously had to come down because they were, that's something you have to keep putting up. The monuments are sort of there. I think we need to contextualize those monuments. I think counter monuments. I think it's a great idea to have a monument to somebody like Nat Turner, the slave rebel.
Yeah, but they're not.
Context matters.
But the point is, look, I agree with that. But the reason we're not putting, but yeah, context does matter. But who's providing the context? Kids who are looking at this monument without the advice of an adult and might not have it, and the adults might be on the side of the Confederacy. We need something deeper. We don't need participation trophies for the Civil War. We need to acknowledge what happened.
Gentlemen, there are two sides to this debate at least, and you presented them well and with decency, and that is appreciated, especially in this climate. Gentlemen, thank you. Poppy.
The death toll rising in the Spain terror attacks. We're going to take you live to the scene in Barcelona as police are trying to track down the driver behind that attack next.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful. He also recently has not demonstrated that he understands the character of this nation.
All right, now, some are calling it a schism within the Republican Party, but it's not that extreme. And yet, to see Senator Bob Corker calling out the president yesterday, calling out his competency, that is unusual. Now it raises the question of how will the president respond, and will that make it worse?
Let's bring in our panel, CNN political analyst Ron Brownstein, political writer for The Atlantic, Molly Ball, and CNN political analyst David Drucker. So, Molly, I was looking at you while the Corker sound was playing and saying, wow, because as we were talking about before, this is a guy who the president considered maybe as VP, Secretary of State. Now, this is not a guy this is not a Lindsey Graham or a John McCain, right? What do you make of it? How big is that he questioned the president's competency and stability?
It's a big deal. I mean, on the one hand, it is a big deal because, as you say, Bob Corker is someone who has really tried to be on Trump's team.
Yeah.
On the other hand, those of us who cover the Congress know that Bob Corker is a truth teller. He is not someone who is going to toe the party line if he doesn't believe it. And that's part of the reason that he was able to, that's part of the reason, frankly, that he rejected the VP slot when he was considered for it, is he just didn't think that he could continue to be on Trump's team if it was going to require him to often, bury his relationship with the truth. So, what the word in that statement that I still wonder about is the word yet, because so many Republicans are still saying he's not yet there. I think that word yet is going to disappear pretty soon as they realize, they come to the end of their rope and they realize it's not that it hasn't happened yet, it's that it's not going to happen.
Well, the measure is progress on the agenda, Ron Brownstein, is that while the president's inability to surrender the me to the we may suit his personal political aims of this new nationalism that he's pushing, it's hurting the ability to get anything done in Congress. It's a distraction, and it's been counterproductive for them, and that's going to frustrate, if nothing else.
That does frustrate, but I do think, Chris, the issue goes beyond that, because in many ways, the Republicans in Congress are in the exact same position as the business executives were, who have stampeded away from him after his remarks about Charlottesville. Because on the one hand, both groups largely agree with him on the economic agenda. Maybe on trade there are some differences, but by and large, they want less taxes and less regulation. And what the business groups were hoping was that business leaders were hoping was they could work with him on those issues and essentially keep out of the racial division and signaling that has really been essential to his message from day one. And I think that has been the posture as well of Republicans in Congress, particularly someone like Paul Ryan, who portrays himself as a disciple of Jack Kemp and has been certainly privately critical and at times publicly critical of President Trump, but essentially has bit his lip with Trump in office because they want to turn to things like taxes and deregulation. Now, the business leaders decided this week that was too high a price to pay, that standing next to Trump because of the social and racial views that he's been expressing was simply too high a price to pay for a kind of cooperation on the economic side. And you do wonder when Republicans in Congress, more Republicans in Congress, will make the same calculation, that even though they want to move ahead on this economic agenda, that ultimately they have to more clearly distance themselves from the president by name.
And Chris, I think that's going to happen when they get a signal from their voters that that's where the voters are headed. And if you talk to Republicans and you talk to their advisors, one of the things they're very cautious about, one of the things they sort of have a good understanding of, is that the Republican base, even though we've seen some cracks in the base when it comes to Trump, is still largely with him. For some of them, they'll never abandon him. For others that are skeptical and don't like the behavior, it's simply too soon.
Just one quick point, David. I mean, historically, every time members of Congress have stood up to a president of their own party, they have done so before the base has moved. The base simply does not move first. Whether it's William Fulbright holding the Vietnam hearings in 1966 when Lyndon Johnson still had overwhelming support among Democrats, or the Republicans voting to create the Watergate Committee in 73 when Nixon was still over 70% among Republicans. I think Nixon only went below 50% among Republicans once, even at the very end. The fact is that leaders have to lead if they believe that the national interest demands it. And you can go back through history and see that there have been occasions when leaders, particularly in the Senate, have concluded they need to challenge a president of their own party because the national interest demand is before their own voters get there, because they don't get there first.
And I think that we've started to see some of that. I do think, though, this is a little bit of a different era. The politics of today is a lot more tribal than it used to be, and I think that has made Republicans that have seen Trump survive scandals that would have sunk anybody else a lot more cautious and a lot more worried, especially since the Republican base in particular loathes its own party and loathes their leaders. We have, though, seen the differences that cropped up this week and a willingness to speak more forcefully against the president. This is something that has been building, and I think in September it could cause real problems as they try to tackle parts of the president's agenda and just things they have to do, like fund the government. There is such a lack of trust now between Republicans on the Hill and the White House. It is going to make it very difficult to get anything big done, let alone, in fact, it's going to make it difficult to get some of the small things done because they are so at odds with each other, and there is just no trust between the two, and you need that if you're going to take these big votes.
Molly, to David's point about tribalism, there's a really interesting new Monmouth poll out. 61% of those who approve of the president's sort of behavior and his presidency say there is nothing ever that he could ever do that would change their mind. And it reminds you of when he said in jest during the campaign, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue, shoot someone, and people would stay loyal.
Yeah, well, but it's kind of ridiculous to say Trump's base supports Trump, because that's why they're Trump's base, right? And the problem for Trump is it is an increasingly shrinking group. The people who strongly support Trump are getting, that is a group that is getting smaller and smaller. It's a percentage of the electorate that's getting smaller and smaller. It has never been a majority of the electorate. A lot of Republicans who might have voted for Trump because they thought he was better than the alternative are moving from the strongly support into the only slightly support category, and that puts them, you know, in danger of moving off the island altogether. So this analysis that Trump's base still supports him, yes, they're always going to be there, but that's not enough to win an election. And I do think you are going to see Republicans realizing that the problem is they're more loyal to Trump than they are to their local congressman or to the Republican Party. And so that really puts these members on an island.
We'll talk about in the next panel what he doing, and whether that speaks to his desire to expand, as we thought he would, to concentrate, which seems more likely.
Stocks plunging to their steepest one-day decline in months. You know, the president likes to talk about the market up, down, 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 down. The president's comments about Charlottesville, are they rattling Wall Street? New details when New Day continues.
49 of those people, and for 25 years there wasn't a problem.
The problem? Historians have repeatedly said this never happened. This latest falsehood coming as President Trump's support base continues to crack over his defense of white supremacists.
We had a lot of people in that group that were there to innocently protest and very legally protest because, you know, I don't know if you know, they had a permit.
The son of Fox CEO Rupert Murdoch, one of President Trump's closest informal advisors, denouncing the president in a scathing email, writing, "What we watched this last week in Charlottesville and the reaction to it by the President of the United States concern all of us as Americans and free people." The president's behavior also wearing thin with a growing list of his Republican allies. We're calling him out by name.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful.
What we want to see from our president is clarity and moral authority. That moral authority is compromised.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell releasing a statement throwing his full support behind Senator Jeff Flake after President Trump went after the Arizona Republican and Senator Lindsey Graham on Twitter. The controversy also taking a toll on the president's bottom line and his business relationships, with 3 charities backing out of scheduled events at Mar-a-Lago. All of this coming as Mr. Trump ends plans for an advisory council on infrastructure. Despite the backlash, the president digging in, calling it foolish to remove statues of Confederate icons, lamenting the beauty that would be taken out of U.S. cities. The president had a much different view when asked about the removal of the Confederate flag during the campaign.
Think it needs to go?
I think it probably does, and I think they should put it in the museum, let it go.
Now, President Trump leaves Bedminster later this morning for a quick trip down to Camp David, only his second visit to the presidential retreat since taking office. But this is not a leisure trip. He'll be meeting with the National Security Council to talk about strategy in Afghanistan and South Asia. Vice President Mike Pence cut short his trip to Central America to return for the meeting. What's not clear is whether any other topics like North Korea will come up. Chris?
All right, Athena Jones, thank you very much for the reporting. President Trump in a war of words with leaders of his own party. What is all this infighting going to do to his ability to push through his agenda? We're going to discuss about that.
Council's collapsing. President Trump is pulling the plug now on an infrastructure advisory panel. That's right, 3 panels down now. The panel was created by an executive order in July. The White House was still courting members, and an official gave no reason for ending that process. But this news comes just a day after 2 other councils disbanded, the Manufacturing and the Strategy and Policy Forum. It's really been an exodus of business leaders prompting their collapse, a reaction to this president blaming both sides for violence in Charlottesville. Trump initially criticized those resignations, but then as the number grew, as there was really nobody left on them, he tweeted he was disbanding the councils. Its members included titans of business, Blackstone, J.P. Morgan, Pepsi, GM, Walmart. They employ hundreds of thousands of Americans. They're employers. They also have millions of customers. Breaking ties with Trump is an unprecedented rebuke to the business-friendly president. It could also hurt his economic agenda. He needs corporate America to help push for tax reform and infrastructure.
All right, ahead, 2 of the nation's top college basketball teams, Clemson and Oregon State, were harsh criticism for his response to the terror attack in Barcelona. His first comment following the tragedy coming in a tweet condemning the act, along with an offer to help. Well, he followed that up with a widely debunked story, tweeting, "Study what General Pershing of the United States did to terrorists when caught. It's no more radical Islamic terror for 35 years."
The president was referring to the supposed practice of shooting Muslims with bullets dipped in pig's blood. He told the same story in 2016 during a campaign rally. There's no evidence to suggest it ever happened. Another version of this, by the way, is burying someone who killed a Muslim who's been killed by American soldiers with a pig. The White House has not responded to a request for comment.
The president appears to be running out of allies in his party. Two Republican senators from the South, mind you, publicly questioning his fitness for office. Listen to Bob Corker of Tennessee, the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who was on the short list for Secretary of State in the Trump administration.
The president has not yet been able to demonstrate the stability nor some of the competence that he needs to demonstrate in order to be successful.
Ability and competence. Tim Scott, the only black Republican in the Senate, says he simply cannot defend the indefensible.
His comments on Monday were strong. His comments on Tuesday started erasing the comments that were strong. What we want to see from our president is clarity and moral authority, and that moral authority is compromised when Tuesday happens. There's no question about that.
The president is busy counterpunching as usual, targeting two Republican senators who called him out, Lindsey Graham and Jeff Flake of Arizona, and seems to be endorsing Flake's Republican primary opponent, tweeting, "Great to see that Dr. Kelly Ward is running against Flake," Jeff Flake, original, "who is weak on borders, crime, and a non-factor in the Senate. Is toxic." The president will be in Arizona on Tuesday.
That tweet got the attention of Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell. He says Flake has his full support. The president also going after Lindsey Graham, calling him a liar for accusing him of saying there is a moral equivalency between white supremacist groups and those who protest against them.
South Carolina senator responding to the president in part because of the manner in which you have handled the Charlottesville tragedy. You are now receiving praise from some of the most racist and hate-filled individuals and groups in our country. For the sake of our nation, as our president, please fix this.
Another CEO, corporate executive, is speaking out against the president's response to Charlottesville. James Murdoch, head of 21st Century Fox, son of informal Trump advisor Rupert Murdoch, is slamming President Trump in a letter obtained by CNN. James Murdoch writes that he's concerned over the president's reaction, saying, quote, "I can't even believe I have to write this. Standing up to Nazis is essential. There are no good Nazis." Adding that Democrats, Republicans, and others must all agree on this. Murdoch also pledges $1 million to the Anti-Defamation League, an organization that fights anti-Semitism. Murdoch's criticism is notable due to his father's relationship with the president. According to sources at